A slave was beaten black and blue by his master. Two subordinates carried him to the front of an iron cage. After the master nodded, the subordinates threw the slave into the iron cage and closed the lid. The two subordinates then brought a bucket of hot water. As the choir sang beautifully, the subordinates poured the whole bucket of hot water into the iron cage. The slave's shrill screams pierced the night sky. The guests were stunned by this scene, and even the choir stopped singing. But it seemed that the master, Dishinkle, had no intention of stopping. He ordered his subordinates to perform the act again. As the second bucket of hot water was poured into the cage, the slave's screams began to dwindle. The children in the choir were so scared that they returned indoors, and the square fell silent. After the third bucket of hot water was poured in, the slave's voice completely disappeared. At this point, the butler quietly hinted to Dishinkle that this act was making the guests uncomfortable, but Dishinkle still had no intention of stopping. He insisted that his subordinates pour in a fourth bucket of water. At that moment, Colin and Eklund stood up. They ignored Dishinkle's objections and opened the iron cage. When they pulled the slave out, the slave was already lifeless. Colin placed the slave on his horse and brought his body back to the farm. When his wife, who was working on the farm, saw this brutal scene, she looked at her husband's corpse with tears in her eyes, but she was powerless against Dishinkle cruelty. Dishinkle was a well-known landowner in the area, and his father had ties with the king. No one could afford to offend Dishinkle in this land. Colin was a retired captain. He originally lived in a neglected veteran slum. To increase national revenue, the king sent people to colonize the Jutland wasteland, attempting to establish a new immigrant settlement. But due to the harsh climate of the wasteland, the poor soil, and the frequent appearance of bandits in the forest, everyone sent there in recent decades had failed. Colin volunteered to go to the Jutland wasteland to reclaim and cultivate the land. However, due to Colin's lowly origins, his father's identity was unknown, and his mother was a maid in the mansion. The ministers didn't take him seriously. Moreover, in their minds, the wasteland only had stones and gravel, and nothing suitable for planting could grow there. The ministers also didn't want to invest more money into the wasteland. Unexpectedly, Colin promised that he didn't need any funding, as his captain's retirement pay would be sufficient. However, if his colony was successful, he demanded that the king give him a noble title, along with his own manor and servants. The ministers, considering the king's orders, and since Colin wasn't spending any national funds, eventually agreed to his request. Colin went to the Jutland wasteland alone, tirelessly exploring everywhere, hoping to find soil suitable for planting. During this time, he also encountered bandits. One named On My News distracted Colin, while another bandit launched a sneak attack. Luckily, Colin, being a former soldier, quickly dealt with the attacking bandit, and On My Muse was so frightened by this that she turned and fled. Shortly after, Colin finally found suitable land. He contacted the locals, workmen and Eklund, to build his house there. Eklund introduced a farmer couple to Colin. They were slaves from Dishinkle's estate. Erickson was great at farm work, and Barbara was an excellent housekeeper. However, because Dishinkle coveted Barbara's beauty, the couple fled from his estate. Even though Colin knew that hiring slaves was illegal, given the couple's unfortunate situation, he employed them as a favor to Eklund. 4 months later, Colin's house was built, and he named it King's House. Meanwhile, at the Holder Manor, Dishinkle heard about Colin building a house in the wasteland, since the surrounding area was his territory. Although he didn't cultivate the wilderness, he didn't allow anyone else to touch it, fearing that someone might challenge his position. Colin wasn't at peace in his manor either. The previously encountered On My Muse occasionally came to steal chickens. Since she was dark-skinned and backed by bandits, the manor staff didn't dare to stop her. Frustrated, Colin hung a row of bells around the perimeter to prevent On My Muse from stealing again. When Barbara was about to do the laundry, she saw two people approaching in the distance. Barbara immediately recognized Major Preisler. Clearly, they were sent by Dishinkle. Erickson and Barbara quickly hid, but fortunately, Preisler's purpose wasn't them. Instead, he was assigned by Dishinkle to invite Colin to the Holder Manor for dinner. Not wanting to offend someone he couldn't afford to, Colin reluctantly agreed. He arrived at Holder Manor in full military uniform. In the manor's hall, Colin met Adele. She was Dishinkle's cousin, and her father was a close friend of the king. Her father always hoped that she would marry Dishinkle. Adele, however, dislikes Dishinkle. Dishinkle was arrogant and extremely harsh. He not only subtly insulted Colin's lowly origins but also emphasized his own noble title. During dinner, Dishinkle was even more direct. He demanded that Colin acknowledge the ownership of the wasteland and specifically had the butler draft a contract. Colin would have to give him 50% of his income, and if Colin's wasteland reclamation succeeded, then all future settlers would become Dishinkle's tenants. Before Colin could leave the castle, Adele offered to help him with his horse. She had never seen anyone dare to confront Dishinkle face to face. After a brief chat, She even invited Colin to attend the harvest festival in a month and gave him her handkerchief as a token. The next day, when Colin returned to the farm, he found that nearly all the workers had left. Only Erikson and Barbara remained. The other workers had been lured away by de Schinkel with high wages. Both Workman and Eklund tried to persuade Colin. In this place, no one dared to oppose de Schinkel. However, Colin was confident because he had the king's seal, and he believed the law would be on his side. After taking all of Colin's workers, the butler investigated Colin's financial status and found that he only had 100 kroner left in retirement funds. If no one helped Colin clear the land, he would certainly sign the contract by winter. Hearing this, de Schinkel was pleased, and sent a special delivery of a little mannequin for Colin to mock his low status. With no workers left, Colin had a bold idea. That night, he hid in the house's shadowy corner, waiting for On My Muse to come to steal food. When she did, he sprang into action and caught her. Colin demanded that On My Muse lead him to the bandits' hideout, and he pointed his pistol at her. Under Colin's repeated threats, On My Muse finally gave in. Early the next morning, Colin followed On My Muse's directions and arrived at the bandits' lair. These bandits were actually nomadic Romani people. Seeing On My Muse lead Colin to their hideout, all the Romani people became wary. After all, Colin was a retired soldier. When Colin stated his purpose, all the Romani people laughed. The country's laws had long abandoned the Romani people. If Colin employed them, he could end up in prison. But Colin didn't care anymore. To show his sincerity, Colin even gave his medal to the Romani leader. Thus, a grand land clearing began. Under the direction of Erikson and Colin, everyone worked diligently, a scene witnessed by Preisler. That night, everyone drank and celebrated together. On My Muse even danced for Colin. She threw a stick tied with a red string in front of Colin and asked him to pick it up. If Colin picked up the stick, he would become a member of On My Muse's clan. Upon learning the truth, Colin was silent for a while. Then he gently tossed the stick back to the ground, as he didn't want to have too much involvement with On My Muse just yet. Seeing the stick lying on the ground, On My Muse seemed somewhat saddened. The next day was the harvest festival, and de Schinkel learned from the butler that not only had Colin employed the Romani people to clear the land, but he had also hidden Barbara and her husband in the manor. Before going to Holder Manor, Colin asked Erikson to buy some white clay from the coast. Then he dressed up carefully and arrived at the manor in grand attire. Due to inherent prejudice, de Schinkel didn't miss the opportunity to mock Colin. Using the excuse that Colin's wig was funny, he made him wear a wig he had prepared. Just as everyone was fermenting, a servant approached Callum and said that Miss Ender was waiting for him by the river. So, Colin went to meet Miss Adele by the river. In truth, Miss Adele didn't like de Schinkel. She was genuinely interested in Colin. However, Adele's father was a greedy man. If Colin succeeded in reclaiming the wasteland, Adele would be willing to marry him. The two made a simple agreement at the river. What Colin didn't expect was that de Schinkel would have Erikson captured and then brutally scald him to death in front of the dinner guests. Witnessing all this, Colin was deeply saddened but helpless. He could only take Erikson's body back to the manor. Seeing her husband's body, Barbara was in deep pain. It was hard to imagine that the husband who had been playing with her during the day had left her forever. At the same time, Erikson's death deeply shook all the Romani people working for Colin. Fearing that de Schinkel would target them, they fled Colin's manor overnight with their clan members. Barbara, now without her husband, initially wanted to leave, but Colin hoped she would stay. He couldn't manage both the fields and the household alone. He wanted Barbara to continue as the housekeeper.
Min mand er død. Du er bange for, om gulvet ikke bliver faret, eller om alting står. Jeg er væk som den lejer!
Jeg kan betale dig.
Med hvad? Du har ikke flere penge.
Når kongen hører i ham.
Hold op med at tale om kongen, som om du kender ham. Du har aldrig mødt ham, det kommer du aldrig til. Og noget engang du findes.
When Barbara went to her husband's grave, her desire for revenge surged again. So, she returned to the manor. What was de Schinkel afraid of? If there was a colony here, what would happen to him? He would lose power and become an insignificant person. This time, Barbara demanded double her salary, and Colin also promised her 10% of the profits. At last, Colin revealed his plan. He wanted to plant potatoes on the wasteland. No matter how poor the soil was, as long as it's kept warm, potatoes could grow healthily. That night, On My Muse returned to the manor. She had fled from the Romani people who troubled her. She didn't want to be sold by them again. Thus, the manor now only had Colin, Eklund, the grieving Barbara, and On My Muse, who had escaped from the Romani people. Seeing that winter was approaching, Colin had to quickly clear a test field to ensure that potatoes could be successfully planted the following year. Soon, the entire wasteland was covered in white snow. Due to the food shortage, On My Muse contracted tuberculosis, even though Barbara prepared medicine for her. Without sufficient nutrition, On My Muse might not survive the winter. Barbara suggested cooking some potatoes, but Colin heartlessly refused. Meanwhile, at Holder Manor, de Schinkel learned from the butler that Colin had imported a batch of potatoes from Germany. Afraid that Colin might actually succeed in reclaiming the wasteland, de Schinkel hurriedly traveled to King's house overnight by carriage. He brought a bucket full of leftovers from his estate. Without hesitation, Barbara took the food inside. They hadn't had meat in a long time. De Schinkel even brought Colin 2,000 kroner. He hoped that Colin would leave with the money, and that he could reclaim land anywhere, as long as he didn't stay here. Holding the heavy bag of money, Colin was finally tempted. However, before they could even finish a few bites of food, Colin threw all the leftovers back into the bucket. Early the next morning, along with the 2,000 kroner, Colin returned everything to de Schinkel. With On My Muse on the brink of death, Colin reluctantly killed the last goat in the house. Although Barbara reminded him that the goat was worth more than the potatoes, Colin didn't hesitate. With adequate nutrition, On My Muse's condition gradually improved. That night, Barbara gave all the blankets to On My Muse, and she gathered her courage to go to Colin's room. Soon after, On My Muse fully recovered, and everyone struggled through the cold and hungry winter. Finally, Colin planted the bags of potatoes, and a new hope slowly grew inside him. On My Muse again offered the stick tied with the red string to Colin, and this time, Colin did not decline. On My Muse found her true place to belong. Just when everything was moving in a positive direction, a hailstorm nearly ruined all their efforts. Angry, Colin roared at the sky. But fortunately, persistence paid off. On My Muse called Colin excitedly from a distance. When Colin and Barbara arrived, they found a small green sprout growing on the land. Not long after, the king received 80 sacks of potatoes sent by Colin. Colin indirectly overturned decades of failure, and the king was thrilled with this achievement. He not only sent Colin dozens of immigrants but also rewarded him with abundant supplies. Colin also smoothly became a royal surveyor. The family's life underwent a qualitative change, and Colin and Barbara's relationship also slowly grew. On My Muse also seemed to have become a part of the family. Everything was moving in a positive direction, but de Schinkel's jealousy had reached its peak. His cousin Adele advised him not to fight Colin, but de Schinkel slapped her. He angrily dragged a maid to the window and, in a beastly manner, he pushed she downstairs in an animalistic manner. A lowly and deeply disturbed mind caused him to lose his sanity. That night, he called for Preisler and brought in a group of death row inmates from the prison, all of which Adele witnessed. While everyone was resting that night, On My Muse suddenly woke from a nightmare. Colin took out his pistol and went outside with Barbara to check, only to find that his horse of many years had been killed. Even worse, a large number of poultry nearby were being attacked by wolves. The immigrant leader speculated that this was man-made and that the wolves were attracted by the scent of blood. The next morning, Colin found the bodies of 3 immigrants not far from the wasteland. He knew this must have been done by de Schinkel. Colin went alone to Holder Manor, but de Schinkel denied any involvement. An angry Colin pulled out his pistol. But in the end, reason prevailed over impulse. Colin left Holder Manor silently. After the funeral for the 3 immigrants, Adele rode to find Colin. Seeing Adele arrive, Barbara was a bit jealous, but she couldn't stop Colin's actions. Adele told Colin about de Schinkel hiring death row inmates and gave Colin their addresses. That day, Colin found the immigrant leader, and among them were some former soldiers. Colin hoped that someone would join him in seeking revenge, but the leader placed the blame on My Muse. Just because On My Muse had darker skin, they concluded that she was an incarnation of the devil and that she had passed her misfortune on to them. If Colin expelled On My Muse from the manor, the immigrant leader would help Colin avenge their companions. Reluctantly, Colin agreed, but Barbara disagreed with Colin's decision. After all, they had been together for a long time, and Barbara already saw On My Muse as family, with de Schinkel eyeing them covetously and the immigrants threatening Colin. Colin had no choice. He found a monastery for On My Muse, where she had to work for her food. On My Muse shed sad tears, but she never blamed Colin. Having been homeless for years, she was already used to it. As she left, she kept calling Colin's name, but Colin never looked back. That night, Colin and the immigrant leader disguised themselves and quietly infiltrated the death row inmates' hideout. They cleverly killed the murderers one by one, including an active duty officer. Only Preisler managed to escape. He hurried to Holder Manor and told de Schinkel about the incident. The next morning, Colin returned to the manor, only to find Eklund alone on the estate. Barbara left a note saying she would never return because he sent away On My Muse. Meanwhile, de Schinkel approached the ruling ministers. Since Colin had killed an active duty officer, and the ministers were already prejudiced against him. They promised to help Deshinkle deal with Colin. However, the reclaimed wasteland had to be distributed with 90% of the profits going to the state. With the ministers' signatures, Preisler led the army to storm King's house, and Colin was about to be taken away by bailiffs for murder. Angry, Eklund tried to intervene but was shot dead by Preisler. Seeing Eklund die in his manor, an agitated Colin attacked Preisler, but he was eventually overpowered by the bailiffs and knocked unconscious. This scene was witnessed by Barbara hiding nearby. Colin was taken to Holder Manor, and Deshinkle, who hated Colin deeply, first beat him severely before throwing him into an iron cage and ordering his subordinates to heat several buckets of water. Meanwhile, Barbara disguised herself as a maid and sneaked into Holder Manor. She put a sedative into a glass of wine, preparing to carry out her revenge. Miss Edel used their engagement as a pretext to lure Deshinkle into her room. Deshinkle knew Edel's intention. She just wanted to save Colin's life, but he didn't suspect the wine on the table. After the sedative took effect, Edel quietly left the room, and Barbara, who was ready, came in. Barbara took out a dagger and stabbed Deshinkle. When the guards arrived, Deshinkle was already beyond saving. The manor was in chaos. Seeing Barbara taken away by the guards, Colin had mixed feelings. The next morning, workmen found the trapped Colin. Miss Edel didn't see Colin again and instead moved back to her hometown in Norway. Colin regained his king's house, but Barbara had to spend her life in Aalborg prison. Returning to the manor, Colin went to the monastery and brought On My Muse back to the manor. Time passed quickly, and the former On My Muse had grown into an adult. Colin's eyesight had dimmed, and his hair turned gray, with most of the manor's affairs being managed by On My Muse. One day, several Romani people came to the manor, wandering around to make a living. Colin finally received a royal decree, conferring upon him the title of Barren with permanent land use rights, a 20-year tax exemption, and an annual salary of 2,000 kroner. His long-held wish had come true, but his heart still felt empty. Over the years, he tried everything to exonerate Barbara. Workmen always tried to help Colin, but they always failed. Workmen also learned that the female prisoners from Aalborg would be sent to Copenhagen slave prison, where there were no human rights or freedom, and Barbara would silently await death. Meanwhile, On My Muse fell in love with a Romani boy who did odd jobs. One day, the boy whistled outside the manor and handed On My Muse a stick tied with a red string. He wanted to marry On My Muse and take her away from here. On My Muse looked at Colin beside her, and Colin nodded approvingly. On My Muse happily picked up the stick, then gave Colin a heartfelt hug. After a brief farewell, On My Muse left King's house with her boyfriend. Though Colin felt a sense of loss, he couldn't stop it. It was the happiness On My Muse deserved. After a short farewell, Colin decided to find his own happiness. He gave up his noble title and left the manor that he would never forget. Not far away, on the Copenhagen slave cart, Barbara was blindfolded, waiting for the prison to receive her. A shrill hoofbeat sounded in her ear. A horse grazed on the grass, while a broken transport cart quietly sat nearby. Handcuffs lay scattered on the ground, but no prisoners were in sight. In the distance, as the sun set, Barbara sat expressionless behind Colin. As the road rolled beneath them, her hands tightly clasped the man's waist. I'm a movie lover. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.